Lemkin Solitaire and Equalizer seeders and planters offer disruptive innovation like vertical banding, dry and or liquid onboard fertilizer, and great prices. Go to lemkindemo.com for more information and to request a demo.
I'm joined right now by someone who spends his whole day, his whole life digging in on trade. And we're very happy to have him here on this webinar and focused on the industry of agriculture. It is Oliver Ward. He is trade director at Agri-Pulse based out of Washington, D.C. Oliver, it is great to be able to chat with you here this morning.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Yeah, so you've been in the U.S. for a number of years, and you came. Your entry into the trade arena was very much from a broader perspective. I guess as you look at being now focused on agriculture, are the agricultural trade issues that different than, well, obviously we're talking a lot about autos here this morning based on the auto tariffs, but obviously there's softwood lumber, there's autos, there's mining. Is agriculture that different?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. And as you say, I've been in the United States for 6 years now, in Washington, D.C., for about 5. Yeah, so my beat before joining Agri-Pulse was a trade policy beat covering everything. And I think from that perch, it looked like agriculture was quite a slim subsection of trade. Since taking on the beat full time, it's really broadened. You realize that you have stakeholders in agriculture, even in the US, state specific and region specific, that might have quite different trade policy goals and interests. And so in some senses, it's the same as other industries where you have this myriad of stakeholders. But I think in agriculture, because it is so broad and you have so many different commodities and so many different regions and so many different environments, it really is even broader, and there is more diversity of opinion and view.
And we know this, when there is trade skirmishes, trade battles, trade wars, agriculture seems to be drug in very early stages, especially at the raw commodity stage for sure. Okay, so you're spending a lot of time thinking about the U.S. strategy and trying to understand what's at work here. How would you characterize the overall U.S. trade agenda right now under President Trump in these early couple months?
Yeah. So on Inauguration Day, we got a memo from the White House, what it called its America First Trade Policy memo. And in that document, the president really sets his stall for his trade priorities under the second administration. Right in the first paragraph, we see language that rails against what the president describes as destructive trade deficits. So there's this real appetite to address the U.S. trade balance. You can also see this in the president's rhetoric since, right? He said he wants to use trade policy to reshore domestic production, a whole raft of industries. He mentioned this in the press briefing yesterday, for example, when he announced those new tariffs on auto imports. So he really sees tariffs as a way to spur domestic production and bring that back to the US. Then there's also this notion of reciprocity that features very prominently in that document. I'm sure we'll come to the reciprocal tariffs that have been previewed for April 2nd, but this idea that we want to be treated in the same way that we treat you is clearly a key pillar of this administration's trade agenda. And I guess the third thing worth pulling out of this document is that there's a directive to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to identify countries with which the U.S. can negotiate new trade deals, either through a bilateral traditional deal or some sector-specific trade agreement that would open new markets in a specific industry. And this is particularly enticing for U.S. agriculture. We've had 4 years under the Biden administration where they didn't do comprehensive FTAs with broad market access. And if we want to find those new markets, obviously there's a myriad of trade barriers that need to be addressed for U.S. ag. Just one final point on it is that notice it doesn't mention those plurilateral or multilateral initiatives. So it is safe to say that this administration is going to pursue a bilateral approach to trade, deal making with maybe individual partners at a time, as opposed to some of these broader frameworks.
I think there are, for those of us that are trying to follow this on a daily basis, God help us, that we see differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. I've talked a lot about the need to make sure you're reading the right textbook. And so Trump 1.0, the art of the deal, negotiating, trying to find a better deal for the United States. In Trump 2.0, it's a lot more about it was in the poll, the restructuring. It's more Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, is more of the textbook at work. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, for sure. There are a number of differences between the first administration and the second administration. Not least for everyone watching it, as you mentioned, the pace is obviously breakneck for all of us.
Yeah.
In the first administration, it took a year and a half to impose new tariffs. They went through very specific investigations. They were adopted for very specific reasons as well, all of which are linked to trade. We saw tariffs on washing machines, on steel and aluminium. We had the metals tariffs linked to national security. We saw the 301 tariffs, which are imposed to counter specific unfair trade practices. This time around, as you say, there's a broader realignment in the sense that we're thinking about trade differently. We're thinking about a broader countering of the trade balance. We're also thinking about reciprocity, but there's also a change in how the tariffs are actually being used as well. I mentioned that those first administration tariffs. This time around, we're seeing them wielded to advance non-trade policy goals, right? So we had the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, for example, ostensibly to address migration or the flow of drugs. We also saw a very short-lived trade war, if we can call it that, with Colombia over the handling of deported migrants. And these are not trade policy issues, but tariffs clearly are still the preferred tool. One other thing that's worth mentioning is he's also raising the issue of tariffs as a revenue raiser much more frequently, right? He suggested that, again, yesterday, that they could be used to fund other economic policy goals as well, like extending his tax cuts. So there are some quite large differences there.
But there's, I guess, can you use tariffs as a revenue generator and use it as a negotiating tactic? Because if you're using it as a negotiating tactic, if you get what you want, you pull those back, which then all of a sudden you're reducing your revenue opportunities. We're still hearing about the External Revenue Service being launched to collect this money before it enters the United States. Are those two strategies in conflict, or do they complement each other?
They're absolutely in tension. And Erica York at the Tax Foundation has been particularly vocal about this, for example. As you mentioned, if you want to collect revenue from tariffs, they have to be imposed. And so if you're negotiating either pulling those back or delaying them or narrowing them, obviously then that impacts the revenues as well. But I'd also like to add the third objective here as well, which might also be in tension, right? Is Trump has mentioned reshoring manufacturing and using tariffs as a way to do that. Well, if you're reshoring manufacturing, then you're reducing imports. And if people aren't importing the stuff, then the tariff is not being paid. And so if that objective is to use tariffs as reshoring manufacturing, then the reliance on tariffs as a revenue raiser also is somewhat undermined. Now, obviously, there are products that we can't make or grow cheaply in the United States. We put tariffs on those. Consumers will either have to pay the tariff or they will eradicate those from their spending habits. So there are products that are going to be going to raise tariffs would raise revenue on, but it's going to vary sector by sector, right? And I think some of the concern is that there hasn't been the time so far to do the kind of line by line industry analysis required that would be able to tell you which tariffs and which rates would be required to reshore, which would be required to use the tariff as a revenue raiser. And absolutely, yeah, those are in tension, and we need more analysis to work that out.
If you compare media load of this topic, comparing Canada and the U.S., it's quite drastically different. If you watch the Canadian news at night, whatever channel you're following, it is this topic from start to finish, and a little bit on the Canadian federal election as well. To be fair at this point, because that's ongoing as well. But it is Trump and tariffs nonstop, front to back, and that's also influenced what's going on with our current federal election as well, as the polls have really flipped. Where does Canada? But in the U.S., that's not happening. It's not as predominant. Where does Canada fit right now as a discussion point, as an ally in the Washington bubble, as you talk to many of the people that are in that?
Yeah, so it may not be as prominent in the news. We've got a ton of issues competing for oxygen. Even just on the trade front, we have a myriad of issues. This week there was a shipbuilding hearing that dominated headlines. But I would say Canada is featuring prominently in the agriculture discussions in Washington, D.C., right? The trade associations are particularly concerned about the tariffs on Canada because they see them as a double whammy to U.S. farmers. Obviously, the size of the Canadian ag export market is significant. It's nearly $30 billion of US ag exports. But tariffs on Canada also affect the input side of things for farmers in a way that tariffs on people like China and other countries do not. We know that we've heard in the media a lot of discussion about the potash that the US farmers rely on. But there's also, agricultural machinery. I was speaking to someone from the Association of Equipment Manufacturers that said, a piece of raw iron crosses the border from the US to Canada 5 times before it becomes a piece of finished farm machinery. And then you've also got, livestock. The US ranchers import cattle for feeder herds. And so I think what Canada is getting a lot of oxygen in the agriculture community in DC because of those reasons. It doesn't just threaten the export market. It also puts pressure on those imports as well.
The question I get a lot is, as I talk to a lot of our Canadian audience and, we've just been through a pretty strong run here of different conferences across Canada and the US. Is a common question is, what do US farmers think about this trade strategy? And that's there's data to talk about that. But from an ag industry standpoint, the ag industry is very focused on expanding export opportunities. You mentioned the Section 301, the shipbuilding probe regarding Chinese ships and trying to bring that manufacturing back to the U.S. Obviously, we've got lots of tariffs that are threatening some of the agricultural export opportunities. What sense do you get from the U.S. ag industry about the current state of the trade strategy?
Yeah, like you, we've had conference season, so I've been to a few of them in recent weeks. I guess we'll start with Poland. There was a poll out, I think it was last week or yesterday, in the last few days from AgWeb that polled farmers and on their opinion of tariffs, and it showed that there's only a tick above 50%. I think 54% disagree with the tariff strategy. So there is still really strong buy-in. We know that Trump carried rural communities in November, and there is speaking to ranchers and farmers, there is buy-in for this idea that if the tariffs incur some short-term pain, it will pay off in the form of long-term gain, right? I was at a meeting of farm cooperatives last month in California where somebody stood up in a room full of several hundred people and said we should all read Bob Lighthizer book. Bob Lighthizer being the architect of trade policy under the first Trump administration, because he said then we would understand why we need these tariffs. But even within that, as I said at the beginning, we've got a broad variety of views. Even within the ag sector, there is some nuance because think about, soybeans and corn, they're not being harvested for some months, right? Yeah. So they can weather some trade turbulence for a little while. They're not going to feel that bite until after the harvest. And then even once they do feel that bite, their financial setup might be so that bills may not come due till near the end of the year. So there really is some nuance to this. Outside of Washington, the view is, I was speaking to a farmer from Kansas recently that said that their local farmers are willing to give Trump a really long runway on these tariffs. But there is nuance within that as well.
Yeah. So, and it's hard to predict the future in times like this, but with the kind of divided Congress that exists and global trade partners, pushing back, how much freedom does President Trump truly have to impose this agenda? Obviously you gave some numbers in terms of some of the support, but and what internal U.S. factors might limit his ability to act unilaterally going forward on this front?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So without getting too in the weeds, the Constitution does give U.S. Congress oversight over U.S. trade policy, which they then divulge to the president. But so far, speaking to Republicans in Congress, many of them are willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt so far, right? So I spoke to members on the Ways and Means Committee a few weeks ago on the use of these emergency powers to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So bear in mind, this was a novel use of those powers. They hadn't been used to impose tariffs on U.S. trading partners before. Nixon did something with a precursor of this power. But the members I spoke to, some of them who are free traders, fairly skeptical of tariffs for anything other than addressing unfair trade practices, all said they're willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, right? One of them even called these emergency powers and the fact that Congress gave them to Trump the original sin. But there was no interest in clawing any of these powers back. Now, it is worth remembering Trump ran on a campaign platform that included tariff proposals, including across-the-board tariffs and steep tariffs on China, up to, I think he floated 50% or maybe higher. And he won that election convincingly. And so many in Congress do see him as having a mandate for tariffs. And again, some of the lawmakers who led the charge on clawing back some congressional oversight in the first Trump term are no longer in Congress, like Rob Portman and Pat Toomey. So it's not totally clear where such initiative to do that and pushback would come from. But I have to caveat this because it's one thing not to challenge the president's use of executive powers, but it's quite another to support it in legislation. So some of this will depend on whether the president and the Republican Party want to use tariffs as an offset for some of their other economic goals in legislation. If that happens, we don't know. There might be some more pushback from Congress. And the other thing is once there is a reconciliation package that gets through Congress and some of these economic objectives are enacted in legislation, lawmakers might have a stronger footing to turn around and say, we delivered on your economic agenda, here are your tax cut exemptions. We haven't ignored the will of the voters. We've listened to them, but on the tariff front now, we can push back a little bit more. So it's really a fluid situation there as well.
Yeah, and April 2nd, next week, which the president has called Liberation Day for the United States, reciprocal tariffs. Now, a lot of R words here. Reciprocal tariffs are not retaliatory tariffs. I think everybody understands what retaliatory tariffs are. Canada has threatened, and other countries, Europe has as well, retaliatory tariffs. If you're going to do that, we'll do this. Reciprocal is different. What should Canadians be aware of when it comes to these reciprocal tariffs that supposedly are going to be launched on April 2nd?
Yeah, so it is quite murky right now. We've had, Scott Bessent last week suggested that they could be limited to a dirty 15, limited to a group of countries that's quite narrow to begin with. The president said yesterday that they would apply to every country. So we don't totally know what the scope of these are going to be. We also don't know how steep they're going to be. The president suggested in the last few days that he could be quite lenient and they may not be a total like-for-like tariff rate of average applied tariffs. So we don't totally know where they're going to land right now. What we can say is that countries have obviously taken different approaches to how to get ahead of these, right? Canada, the European Union, China, they're all retaliated, have signaled that they will retaliate to tariffs that have already been put in place. Although Europe has softened slightly in recent days in delaying its retaliation. And other countries, the UK, Vietnam, India, we've seen some suggestion of concessions to Trump. There's been reporting the UK is considering cutting its own digital services tax applied to US tech firms. India took the first steps this week towards dropping their DST. And Vietnam, I believe, has also talked about tariff cuts. And so there is a divergence in countries trying to get ahead of these, even though we don't know what they're going to look like yet. And so I guess we'll see on April 2nd how successful those efforts have been. I texted with someone from the UK government last week when they were in Washington, who seemed very optimistic after those meetings that both countries were on the same page and hoping to do something that would avoid those reciprocal tariffs for the UK. And Mexico may also be one to watch on that because they are a major US trading partner, but Claudia Sheinbaum's government hasn't responded with the same vigor as say, Canada or the EU. So they may end up being a bellwether here. But I would say, bearing in mind heading into those April 2nd tariffs, is we might get a sense of what the right approach is or what the more successful approach is to deal with Trump when he makes some of these tariff threats.
Yeah, you mentioned the AgWeb poll. Carolyn points out in the Q&A about the results. And I knew I had the results of this poll because I was the person that released the results fresh off the presses last week on AgriTalk when I was guest hosting. So here's the results. So the first question was, do you support President Donald Trump's use of tariffs as a negotiation strategy? 41% saying yes, 54% saying no, and just under 5% saying unsure. The next question was, do you believe the USDA will compensate farmers for losses if agriculture is affected by a trade war, similar to the compensation provided through the Market Facilitation Program? That's the MFP program it's often referred to. In Secretary Rollins' confirmation hearing, she talked about how she had talked to former Secretary Perdue about how he rolled out those MFP payments. 34% said only 34% said yes. That's an interesting piece, because on AgriTalk last week, we definitely chatted about the fact that that's less than we thought it would be. Only 34% of people saying yes, they will be backstop, because I think that backstop, Oliver, to wrap up here, that's what holds people to the "I'm with him" part, is those backfill payments.
Yeah, we also know that the Commodity Credit Corporation, which funded those payments last time, is depleted. It has a borrowing authority of up to 30 billion. It doesn't have anywhere close to that right now, so that could also be playing on people's minds as well.
Yeah. I want to mention to everybody that if you do have a question, and some people have already started to do this, put your questions into the Q&A section on Zoom here, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in the back end of the program. Hey, Oliver, hopefully you're sticking around for some of the Q&A, but thanks a lot for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Likewise.
Hey, that is Oliver Ward. He's trade director at Agri-Pulse. Encourage you to check out Agri-Pulse's work. Sarah and the entire team, Oliver there, are fantastic when it comes to covering ag policy issues from a U.S. perspective.